Okay, hello everyone, and you're very welcome to tonight's webinar. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Nathan Reeves, and I'll introduce Nathan in just a moment. Um, just to put our next date in our diary, just so that I don't forget, and that will be the 28th of November with Joe Warren from Technological University Dublin, where he'll be sharing his thoughts around our scientific cultures benefiting scientific progress. So make sure to put that into your diary. So we are tonight hosting our webinar because we're being joined at 4 a.m. in Australia with Nathan Reeves, and he is a renowned exercise physiologist, and he's going to present the new International Clinical Exercise Physiology Professional Standard. So really looking forward to hearing that information. Nathan is a senior lecturer at the School of Health Sciences and Social Work in Griffith University, Australia. He is the current chair of the Exercise and Sports Science Australia Standards Council and director and company secretary of the International Confederation of Sport and Exercise Practice. So very well placed to tell us and to share the new professional standards. So with that, Nathan, over to you.
So good morning, good evening to everybody, and thank you again, Carla and Tom, for the invitation to share on what I think is a really exciting development on an international stage for the first time ever for us to be having a set of international professional standards for the clinical exercise physiology profession. I'm going to provide a little bit of context about where I am actually calling from, and hopefully we can get a little bit of context. Carla, can I just get a thumbs up from you because you're the only person I can see on the screen?
Yeah, no, that's good. To let our audience know if they do have questions that they can put them into the Q&A area. Thanks, Nathan.
So this is a little island that I'm calling from, the other side of the planet from you guys, Australia. Carla and I were just chatting, warming up my voice box, I suppose, in the last couple of minutes, and she has hung out in recent years where I'm calling from today. So if you look on the east coast of Australia, Brisbane, I come from calling in today from a little place which is just south of there, which is called Burleigh Heads. So that's where I work and play and raise a couple of young kids. So really exciting to have the opportunity to be able to bounce around the world and share all sorts of things. There is a custom that we are happy to work with from Australia and recognise the First Peoples, the First Nations peoples from where we're calling. So for me, that's the Yugambeh people, the Aboriginal people of Burleigh Heads, and we pay our respects to past, present, and emerging First Nations people as well. So I'm just going to shuffle a couple of screens around to make sure. Just another thumbs up if you don't mind, Carla, that's been shared appropriately. Excellent. All right, so let's work through the presentation, and I'll do my best to save some time at the end to have any questions or comments or some speculation around what clinical exercise could potentially look like for you in Ireland and for the Irish Sport and Exercise Science Association. So the topics I wanted to cover on this evening are generally an overview of the International Confederation, from which I'm primarily representing today, provide a little bit of insight into the process that's being used to establish the new set of international clinical exercise physiology standards, give you a little bit of an oversight of what the end product is and what our planned next steps are in regards to the clinical exercise physiology standards. Don't have a lot of time this morning. I could easily talk about this for an hour and a half or two, but as you're looking over the vision, mission, values, and purpose of the International Confederation. I just wanted to share with you the genesis of how this came about. So going back in 2019, there was a few of us sitting around the breakfast buffet in Melbourne. A past president of Exercise and Sports Science Australia, current president, and the vice president, and we were talking about the gains that we had made as an association, being Exercise and Sports Science Australia, over the relatively short 30 years that we've been established. And we were saying that we had made significant gains within Australia in developing the professions of exercise science, sports science, and mainly clinical exercise physiology. At that point in time, we had only a small number of memorandums of understandings, usually unilateral MOUs with other countries like ACSM. We had something generating with BASES, and we primarily were the big brother, a mentor to New Zealand's equivalent, which is SES-NZ. And we were also talking about the opportunities to grow those relationships a little bit more and strengthen that network on an international stage. What was also present and front of mind for us is the opportunities and the challenges associated with other disciplines and other professions wanting to move into the space of the provision of physical activity and exercise in the clinical space, and namely the physiotherapy professions in an international stage. And we were quite keen to take the gains that we had made within Australia and look to if you like, assert our space and hold our space in an international landscape. So what we did is in the August of 2019, we met with a number of the representatives from ACSM, BASES, CSEP, which is the Canadian version, Australia and New Zealand, in Auckland, and we resolved to put together a steering group to develop the International Confederation. 12 months later, so September of 2020, we launched the Confederation. We set it up as a not-for-profit organisation within Australia. We had established a strategic plan, a constitution, and we set forth at that point in time. These are the current vision of the organisation, of the Confederation, to positively impact individuals, communities, countries by advancing the international practice of sport and exercise science. So at the time that we launched at the Q3, Q4 of 2020, we had the foundation members of ACSM, BASES, CSEP, ESA, and New Zealand. And since that time, we've welcomed associate members, being firstly the Irish Association, which we're delighted, and we have a number of other associations that are on the cusp of joining as associate members and or full members of the Confederation. The current board of the Confederation includes Associate Professor Kay Davison as Chair, Assistant Professor Kirsten Lane as Deputy Chair, Dr. Andy Scott from BASES, Associate Professor Nick Gant from New Zealand, and myself from Australia as well. If you're interested after this, there's the Confederation's website, and I'll provide a link to that at the end of the presentation as well. As I said, we did launch in 2020, so we set about advancing our strategic plan at that time, and we've since migrated to a new strategic plan that takes us through to 2030. The recent achievements of the Confederation are that we have developed a set of professional and ethical practice standards, and that's available on the website. So that's a beacon or a guide for existing and emerging associations and confederations to be able to use that as a tool. We have a website where individuals and organisations can access resources, professional development, and the like. We're mentoring a number of regions and countries in their particular journey. And if I have time at the end, I might make reference to some of our recent interactions on that level. Not that long ago, only a couple of weeks ago, we had World CEP Day, which was very well received. And what I'm talking about today or tonight is the launch of the new international professional standards for clinical exercise physiology. Don't expect us to get into the weeds too much here, but this is the strategic plan, 2020 to 2023. And I'm going to pull out one of those particular pillars of the strategic plan, which speaks to the development and the adoption of sets of international standards in the space of ES, exercise science, sports science, SS, and CEP as well. All right, so it was February of 2021 that we did start the first work in developing these international CEP standards. And stage one of that project saw us doing an audit, firstly an environmental scan of existing clinical exercise physiology standards from around the world, and then undertaking an audit. And that was really designed to look at the similarities and the differences that existed in those sets of standards or frameworks that existed. What we quickly realized in our environmental scan is that there was primarily, or only, 5 sets of standards that existed at an international level, and they just happened to be the 5 sets of standards that existed under the 5 foundation member organisations. There was a degree of convergence and also unique differences in those sets of standards and how they were documented, how they were designed to be implemented in the various countries. So these are the sets of standards and documents that we did pull from the 5 foundation member organisations, and that was used as part of our audit. As an example of the similarities and differences, I've just pulled a couple of those short excerpts of a couple of those sets of standards or SOPs, scopes of practice. And as you can see, they're ranging from the US under ACSM, thank you. The job task analysis is primarily what's used there. And that really sort of outlines things like it needs to be a degree qualification with a certain number of hours of hands-on practical experience in the clinical domain. What a CEP looks like there is that that particular health professional prescribes exercise, basic health behaviour interventions, and promotes physical activity for chronic diseases and conditions. We move on to Tabasi's document. It was a role description, and I've actually got the wrong logo up there, but it's actually, sorry, not for BASIS, it's for CSEP. But the scope of practice for CEPs is working with apparently healthy populations and individuals, but those with also with chronic and complex conditions as well. Again, delivering physical activity and exercise is the primary tool that we're using, providing education, lifestyle modification, and behaviour change. And finally, the SOP for Australia under ISESA includes things, as I've previously mentioned, but also speaks to the importance of using evidence-based judgment and clinical reasoning, person-centred approach, and also delivering services in a culturally safe and inclusive manner. So that gives you some idea of the commonalities, but the differences that existed in the 5 sets of standards, and perhaps some sense of the complexity of the audit process that we're just about to embark on. So once we had completed the environmental scan, we started the audit process, and we decided to use Exercise and Sports Science Australia's set of CEP standards as the base for the audit. And the primary reason for that is that it was the most contemporary set of standards. It was set of standards that were released at that time, closest to when we had done the audit, so the newest set of standards. And it also arguably was the most established domain or area where clinical exercise physiology was practiced. So we decided to use that as the base. Having said that, it wasn't at the exclusion of any other components or factors and items that existed in the other sets of standards. It was just used as the base tool, and we needed to use that as the foundation from which we worked. So that set of standards was underpinned by 4 domains or 4 standards domains, being that of professional practice, foundational knowledge, assessment and client management, design and delivery of evidence-based interventions. So I'm going to speak to those particular domains or standards now and give you a bit of an overview of what our audit found. The diagram for the next couple of slides is essentially an onion, and those at the center of the onion primarily were those elements or smaller components that sit within the standards domain that were covered by a number, if not all, of the sets of standards. So you can see there that on the inner circle of this diagram for the professional practice domain, that most sets of the standards, the 5 standards that we audited, did make reference to practicing within the scope of practice code of conduct and ethical practice and in accordance with local legislation, regulations and standards. Then as we move to the outer layers of the onion, these were elements that were less well represented. So the key findings for professional practice is that there was the greatest degree of variability of the 4 domains in professional practice. The themes that related to the approach to practice, so practicing in a culturally safe, client-centered and reflective practice way, were less consistently covered, and the theme of emergency procedures was only covered in 2 sets of standards. The standard domain of foundational knowledge was explored next. And as you can see there, I don't expect you to read through all of that, but again, there were some elements that sat within this particular standard domain that were very well represented across the 5 sets of standards and others that were less well represented. The theme covering an understanding of relevant medical conditions and how exercise and other treatments within the scope of a clinical exercise physiologist was least well represented and covered. So there was a high degree of variability, interestingly, for this particular element. The theme covering approach to practice, including the ability to examine and apply principles of biopsychosocial care, person-centered care, and the like, had near complete agreement across the sets of standards, which was great. And there was a high degree of variability in the definition of what value-based care meant across the 5 sets of standards. Assessment and client management, as you would hope and expect, there was most degree of homogeneity in this particular standard domain. So that's somewhat reassuring. There was only partial exploration of the way that we communicate as clinical exercise physiologists and the modalities with which we use to communicate in those standards. So that was an interesting finding there. And the last standard domain being that of design and delivery of evidence-based interventions. There was a high degree of consistency here across the standards. Some themes were not linked to the full range of conditions. So some sets of standards tended to focus in on cardiovascular, neurological, musculoskeletal conditions, perhaps at the exclusion of some of the others. And that possibly represented the degree of maturity of the disciplines, the professions in the various jurisdictions, and the recognition of them as well. So that audit process was very interesting. We published on that in the JSEP journal, and I'll provide a link to that later down the track for those that are interested in going into more of the detail about how we undertook that audit and the audit findings. Once we had completed the audit, we then moved on to the next stage of the project, which was undertaking a Delphi study to develop a consensus around what an international set of CEP standards should look like. And we did set up an expert working group to have carriage and oversight of this process. So back in September and October of 2023, so about 12 months ago, we sent out calls for expressions of interest to form the expert working group. And this is just a little bit of a timeline of the activities that flowed. And I'll speak to each of these in a couple of minutes. But once the expert working group had been formed, they set to task, and that started in November of last year. There was several months where that occurred, and that working group met and completed questionnaires, and I'll talk to that again in a second. Once the draft set of CEP standards were developed, that went out for external consultation through the months of April and May of 2024. That came back to the working group, and during June and July of this year, there was some minor tweaking of that, capturing some of the sentiment and the feedback that we did get from that external consultation phase. There was a steering committee that also was involved and was able to provide some guidance on developing the final product, and that was completed in July of this year. That final product of standards was then taken to the International Confederation Board for deliberation, and in the month of October, that was formally adopted and confirmed as the set of the CEP standards. So fairly long journey. If you think back to this, commenced in February of 2021. And it's now just been confirmed in the last couple of weeks, which is an exciting development. So what occurred through this stage 2 of the process, and how did we go about forming the expert working group, and what was their roles and responsibilities over that window of time that they were working quite hard? The steering committee did set some criteria around who should be involved in the working group and what degree of pedigree and experience in clinical exercise physiology standards that they needed to have. And you can see there, I won't read that verbatim, but there was an expectation that to be accepted as a working group member, needed to have university qualification and experience and skills in the clinical exercise physiology space, numbering 10 years or more, or having experience in developing or reviewing clinical exercise physiology standards, or being heavily embedded in the curriculum that is CEP at various institutions that deliver this qualification, and having a minimum of a 4-year bachelor degree. So we set that criteria. We had 23 members on the working group from around the world, represented by 17 countries. We set a ceiling, a maximum of 2 representatives from any one country or region. So we think it was very well representative of the practice of clinical exercise physiology or from around the world, represented on that working group. So the working group undertook its role in a number of phases. We did start by having a look at the audit findings. What were the range of standards and elements that sat within those standards that were collected during that audit process? And the working group was asked to rank those various elements that were identified in a way that determined whether they were important, essentially, and how important they were on a 9-point Likert scale, and whether they should be core or non-core to the final set of CEP standards. And core meant that it should sit front and center around what the clinical exercise physiologist should look like, and something that was agreed upon in all regions, all countries, and that proved to be a little bit challenging. Those that were perhaps not at that threshold could be captured still, but would be represented as a non-core element. So perhaps in some regions, some jurisdictions, it was easily accepted and understood that that particular element made up a core component of the practice of a clinical exercise physiologist. In other regions and countries, maybe not yet, that the profession had not yet developed that far, and it could perhaps be captured as an aspirational element as opposed to something that was hard and fast, a requirement for the practice of CEP. So that was phase one. If I could just jump to the bottom of the slide there, we did the steering committee set a consensus threshold when we were undertaking these surveys, and that consensus threshold was set at 80%. So on that Likert scale of 1 to 9, if a rating of 7 to 9 from a working group member suggested that it was an important component, an important element, and or it needed to be core to the set of elements, that 80% threshold was set, and we used that as an in or an out sort of guideline for us. Phase two of the projects, phase two of this stage of the project, the working group members were asked to identify any elements that were not included in the initial audit, were not initially presented to them in phase one. Any characteristics of a clinical exercise physiologist that weren't captured and that possibly should be considered by the working group as a key feature, a key component of a CEP. Phase three of the project, we were asked to then go back in and provide a justification of the decisions that were made in phase one and phase two, and that information was socialized around the entire working group, because in phase five, the working group was then asked to consider more broadly if an element had not reached consensus for inclusion and had not reached consensus for being core. We were then asked to look at the qualitative information that was collected in phase three and to reconfirm whether we still held our position on it being core or non-core, included or not included on that Likert scale. So we had a second sweep as a result of having visibility of the reasoning behind the other working group members and their decision, which was an interesting process as well. And ultimately, that meant that some of the elements did shift from being excluded and not meeting that threshold to being included, and some being determined as core and not necessarily as core. Again, it was around the understanding, the interpretation, and not to sound condescending in any way, but the maturity of the professionals within their various regions and how they saw clinical exercise physiology in their own countries and regions. So it was really a great process to be supportive of each other, even though that we did have the specific role and remit for us to be delivering upon. The working group then undertook a range of focus groups and unpacked some of that quantitative and qualitative data. That was an interesting process to have 21 representatives from 17 countries undertake a focus group. If you think it's hard for us to align two countries and two different time zones, try to think about how it would be to do that in 17 countries and regions around the world. But we did it. And there was 3 different focus groups. And I think in my time, my local time, we set an 8 a.m., 12 p.m. and an 8 p.m. meeting to capture everybody from around the world in a 1 hour discussion. So it was an interesting process. But again, it provided supernumerary to the primary remit or purpose of this project. It did provide a great opportunity to better understand each working group member's perspective around clinical exercise physiology and what we do in our own countries and where we would like to see the profession go, as well as what our core role was, which was to determine the shape and the look of the ultimate international set of CEP standards. So after the focus groups, we then did go around again, have a look at some new elements that were identified and rank them on that 9-point Likert scale and determine whether they should be core or non-core. So it was a fairly exhaustive process to arrive at the final draft set of standards. And then in phase 6, that was sent out for external consultation around the world, around our respective networks, to capture as much information as possible. And I'm quite happy to say that we had 40 responses to that external consultation, and we were able to digest some of that information as a steering committee and as a working group to shape the final set of standards. So that very easy and simple process resulted in where we are, which is the release of the International Clinical Exercise Physiology Professional Standards. And the next couple of slides speak to show you a couple of the pages of the set of standards. I would encourage you to go back, and I've got a link at the end, go back and have a look at the final document. It provides a much more of a rich overview of the process that was followed, the methodology that was that was used, the governance that was employed, and working group significantly to the product here. Some of the key pages which capture the standards domain and the elements that sit within them. Okay, so the first standard domain is professional practice, and you remember back in our audit, we did do an audit of these and set the structure around this particular domain of professional practice. And so, excuse me, here are the elements and the final product. I'm not going to read through line by line here, but I just want to give you a bit of a sentiment of what this standard domain looks like. So there are a number of elements, 6 elements that sit within here, within this domain, that are what we believe is core to the practice of clinical exercise physiology and in this standard domain of professional practice. And they are including things like working within SOP, COC, and aligned with ethical practice, working in accordance with local legislation, regulations, and standards, which is a really important feature, practicing in a culturally safe and sensitive manner, and being sensitive to equity, diversity, inclusive practice, and what that looks like within local jurisdictions, and working with a focus on client-centeredness and taking that client or patient, whatever you prefer to call them, as being the focal point of how we deliver our services. Working collaboratively with the backdrop of multidisciplinary practice being a really key pillar of what we should be doing, and identifying potential risks and having risk management strategies and mitigation strategies in place. 1.7 there has got an asterisk beside it, and the footnote down at the bottom here. This is one of the elements that, interestingly, in our audit and also in our working group deliberations, was not unanimously seen as being a core pillar, a key feature of clinical exercise physiology practice. Now, some of us online tonight might be sitting there scratching our heads saying, reflective practice should be part of our DNA. This is what we do. It's an absolute no-brainer for us to reflect on how we provided our service or our intervention and look to grow and further develop our practice and our services to our clients, but also to promote the sustainability and durability of us as clinical exercise physiologists, as practitioners as well. But it was seen as an element that in some countries was emerging, and how to go about that was not necessarily fully grasped. And we see this as an opportunity for the Confederation and the members of the Confederation to really nurture and support those jurisdictions to have, in the next sweep, in the next time we do a refresh of these standards, being, I would hope, sitting as core of what we do. We are reflective practitioners, and that's what we do, and that's how we practice. The next standard domain is foundational knowledge, and you can see that there are four elements that make up this standard domain. Again, I won't read verbatim through here, but one of the footnotes does speak to what is foundational knowledge for a clinical exercise physiologist, and that's listed down at the bottom of the page. So that was really important for us to capture that in this particular document, so that there was an understanding that as a base level, a clinical exercise did have foundational knowledge across a number of those, or all of those domains that are listed at the bottom of the page. The foundational knowledge of a clinical exercise physiologist should be able to examine the principles of psychosocial care, value-based care, person-centered care, use the cultural determinants of health and apply this in the promotion of physical activity and health and well-being of populations. Having the capacity to evaluate the effect of commonly prescribed medications, diagnostic procedures, medical, surgical, other interventions on resting and exercise-related physiological responses and adaptations across the full spectrum. So these are sorts of things that are captured in this particular standard domain. Standard 3, assessment and client management. Again, nothing too remarkable here. I'll let you skim over that. But this was, as you might recall, in our audit, the standard domain that was most consistent across sets that we did audit. And when it came to the working group, this is where there was a high degree of agreement and consensus reached around these four particular elements, being the pillars of how a clinical exercise physiology assessed clients and how they managed the services that they provide to their clients or patients. And finally, the standard domain of case formulation and design and delivery of exercise-based interventions. Again, four elements that sit here as core, if you like, and the fifth element there being 4.5, formulate strategies during treatment to enable client self-management. Again, the working group was not fully in agreement around this particular element. There was some strong feelings that self-management should be at the center of what we do as practitioners, but that how that translates into practice was something that in some jurisdictions was emerging. So again, this is one of the things that we acknowledge is in some countries this the various regions might be on a journey through this process of enabling client self-management. So that's the set of CEP standards, international CEP standards. Sounds really simple, but we think it's a great piece of work and will provide a resource and a tool for those regions and countries that have well-established clinical exercise physiology professions and professionals. And I'll speak to how we hope that this resource can be used into the future in those established jurisdictions. But in those regions where it is yet to be developed and they are perhaps contemplating their journey or have started their journey, we feel that this will be a really valuable tool for those regions, for those associations, organisations similar to yours that are looking to develop clinical exercise physiology further in your country, in your healthcare system and compensable systems. So stage 3 of this project is obviously the rollout of the clinical exercise physiology standards. And in the next couple of months, we hope to work with the member organisations of the International Confederation to implement this set of clinical exercise physiology standards. We are working towards a deadline where the member organisations, full member organisations of the International Confederations at time of renewal need to demonstrate that their clinical exercise physiologists meet these core standards. And that framework and that tool with which we're going to roll out in the unknown period of time ahead is yet to be developed. We've got some ideas, but that's a work in progress. As I said, for those countries and regions that are yet to start their journey or are about or have just started their journey, we hope that this set of standards will be a valuable tool for them, and they're not starting from zero, that they have some resources to really lean upon to expedite that process that countries like ISESA, Australia, and the professional association that is ISESA have been working on for the last 30 years. That's really going to speed up that process. And I can give some examples of that in the couple of short minutes that I do have, and I'm wrapping up in 2 minutes, Carla. I had the opportunity around the middle of this year to go out and meet with representatives in Istanbul in Turkey, and they are very highly motivated to develop clinical exercise physiology units of study in their tertiary institutions and develop the profession. And they're asking, I gave a similar presentation, obviously not the final set of standards because they weren't completed at that time, but the process and the work that we had done, and they were very motivated to get access to the final set of standards and receive support from the members of the Confederation to really agitate for the profession, develop education programs, reach out to their healthcare systems to assert the efficacy of the interventions that clinical exercise physiologists can play. We've had some recent meetings with Northern Hemisphere countries, Norway, and there's another one that I've just momentarily, Sweden, I believe, who are really keen to advance their early stage professions and professionals of clinical exercise physiology. So it's an exciting period ahead, and we look forward to working with the Irish Association, who are associate members of the Confederation as well. So as I alluded to earlier and throughout my discussion, here's some links to the Confederation's website, a link to where you'll find a full set of standards, CEP standards, some links to a couple of the publications that we've been able to have accepted, the first being with the British Journal of Sports Medicine on the genesis or the introduction of the Confederation, and JSEP, the journal article on the audit process. And there's my email address if anybody wants to hurl abuse or ask any questions of me at any point in time. I'm happy to leave that up there for a second, Carla, as I throw to you for Q&A section, and then if you want to hit me with the time that you'd like me to maybe stop that, and we'll just sort of have talking heads on the screen.
Sure, sure. Nathan, thank you very much for that exclusive overview of the new standards, but also really interested in the process of going through because in some cases we want to know what the new standards are, but it's really interesting the evolution of how those standards came about. So really interesting presentation. So thank you for that. Just to remind our audience who are joining us that yes, you can post a question if you have one. And in the interim period, I will lead off with some questions. And again, I preface my questions that I'm a biomechanist, so don't hold that against me. But my first question would be, how do you foresee standards improve clinical practice, and particular in relation to patient or client outcomes?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the audit process, Carla, did identify that we're all doing some really good stuff around the world, but there was also some really strong opportunities in various jurisdictions to assert, and I use that word advisedly, to assert that clinical exercise physiologists should be front and center of any multi-D care team for so many physical and psychological conditions. And I suppose that's where we can really be advancing the recognition of clinical exercise physiology through these standards. In some countries and some regions, clinical exercise physiologists are very well recognised for their role, for example, in cardiorespiratory rehabilitation and preventative measures. But that might be the extent of it.
Mm.
But yet we know, and the evidence is showing us now, that the role of exercise physiologists, exercise physiology delivered interventions for the prevention and management of mental health conditions um, is strong in the areas of cancer prevention and management and recovery from cancer and optimizing health outcomes and quality of life. The evidence is very strong there around the clinical exercise physiologist professionals delivering these interventions. So I see that this as being a tool to perhaps take the handbrake off or take some of the blinkers off what might exist in some jurisdictions and really see the profession move into spaces that it's not yet recognised and established as yet. There's also an opportunity here for this tool to demonstrate that clinical exercise physiologists do have a strong underpinning of the way we go about. Where, no offense, we're not personal trainers. Personal trainers are part of the continuum of delivering exercise-based interventions, and they play a valuable role, a valuable role. But clinical exercise physiologists are highly trained health professionals that can sit alongside, and they must sit alongside physiotherapists, occupational therapists, dietitians, and the like, and deliver services to those clinical populations. So I see this as an opportunity to, again, where CEP is not yet recognised, for us to say, look, here's the standards that we all comply with. Here's the qualifications that we have. Here's the way that we go about our business, and it is consistent with those other recognised, perhaps more well recognised health and medical professionals out there. So hopefully that sort of answer your first question about the utility and the value of this tool, and where I see it can really have a positive impact and significant impact in the period ahead.
Mhm. Do you think in that regard there's more opportunity for a clinical physiologist to be part of that multidisciplinary approach and team then? Do you think, does these standards kind of open the door for that?
Can I flip that on its head again and say, why shouldn't we should be shifting that narrative around a bit and say, are we being negligent to our patients, to our compensable healthcare systems, who have focused on patient outcomes, but also the bottom line and the cost associated with healthcare, should we be asserting that we are being negligent if clinical exercise physiologists are not sitting as part of that team?
Sure.
So shifting that around, rather than asking the question around why can't we be involved, why should we not be involved?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, really, really good point made there. And I know that it's probably, you've just arrived at these standards. How do you foresee the role of a clinical exercise physiologist evolving with these standards in the next 5 to 10 years, for example?
One of those points, excuse me, that I raised was around being a reflective practitioner. And that was an interesting, in some countries, and I would be very confident, although Ireland wasn't part of the process and didn't have a working group member, but certainly, and I hope this is not offensive, the UK did have a couple of representatives that they saw reflective practice being what we do. We get taught about it as we go through our studies. And we carry that forward, and there's an expectation in early career practice that we set a team around us to help us be good reflective practitioners, and then we carry that through our professional life. I see that being one example, just one example of how this set of standards and the element that's sat within that standard can look to really thinking of the word drag, but that's a little bit negative, but help motivate everybody to aspire to being really strong, reflective practitioners. I see this set of standards as being, again, an opportunity for individual practitioners to go, okay, so this set of standards captures this. Why aren't I working in this particular space? When I go out and interact with my referral networks, my referral pathways, whether that be GPs or specialists, whether that be compensable systems in Australia, that's Medicare. We have compensable systems that are workers' compensation in Department of Veterans Affairs, so working with ex-military personnel in aged care. My set of standards say that I can do this. My training says that I can do this. And when you're having those conversations, I can provide this level of care. I can provide this service to this portion of your cohort that you represent. Or in where I primarily practice, an example might be in workplace rehabilitation and injury management. Exercise physiologists can be providing services to mitigate the risk of a worker sustaining an injury in the first place, and then expedite that RTW, that return to work for that worker to their pre-injury role, or as close as possible to their pre-injury role. The standards that underpin what I do say that I have the skill set to do this. Today, to take a biopsychosocial approach, and in the workers' compensation compensable system, we know that there are a lot of complicating factors that sit as to why it might be difficult for an injured worker to return to work. They are physical, yes, but they can also be psychological and social. So I have the skill set to be able to deliver my intervention, have sensitivity to that, and really support the claimant, the injured worker, back to work. So why can't I be working in this space? And you go to, if CEP is not recognised by the workers' compensation system in Ireland, you go and have those conversations. Why are we not front and centre and doing this? Because we have the skill set to do that. There is evidence that sits in other countries where CEPs are applying their trade in this area. And let's work together to develop a construct for care of your claimants or patients to get the best outcome for the individual, to get the best outcome for the system that's supporting that individual as well, that compensable system. Long-winded answer, but you can tell I get
just as we're
got a
talking
little bit of a role.
Yeah, no, just as we're talking there, some questions have come in from our audience. We're starting to run out of time, but if we could get maybe very short responses to some of our questions. So the first one is, how would you differentiate the role of the physiotherapist from the role of the CEP in chronic condition space? Ireland is having significant difficulty seeing a distinction past physios.
I'll give a quick answer. Difficult. Look, within Australia and a number of other countries, the similar sorts of interactions are occurring between clinical exercise physiologists and physiotherapists. Good practitioners understand where there are commonalities in SOP scopes of practice and where there are differences. I don't know the training framework for physiotherapists in Ireland, but if I can pull back and take a broad consideration of what I do know at an international level, exercise physiologists are exquisitely skilled in using physical activity, exercise, and lifestyle modification to provide care through those modalities to patients. Some physiotherapists have that skill set commensurate with exercise physiologists. I would suggest that most of their training does not have that. So what are the commonalities and what are the key differences, and really work with those to assert the position of CEP alongside, not superior to, not inferior to, but alongside. And how best can we collaborate to deliver the best care for the patients and the best outcomes for the system? Really difficult question. You could do a 30-minute, 60-minute presentation on that. But
Sure.
good question.
Yeah. And I think another audience member also of similar lines said, is there any opposition from other healthcare professionals to the clinical exercise physiologist and becoming valued an equal member of the healthcare team? And if so, how would you suggest to overcome this? And again, if we could have a very brief response, but I appreciate it. You could talk at length on this issue.
Yeah. So if you go back to the early part of my presentation where I said there was 3 of us sitting around the breakfast buffet in 2019 in Melbourne, that was part of the reasons, one of the key reasons why we decided to set up this international confederation, is because if physiotherapy at an international level really consumed all of the oxygen in this space of delivering exercise intervention, where would it leave clinical exercise physiology? We could be made redundant. So it has been front of mind for us at a domestic level and an international level, and that's what this confederation is really driving here. What I would say from lived experience and as past president of ESSA, we have had we've been on a journey with our equivalents in physiotherapy, is that be respectful, always take the high road and celebrate the differences and work alongside in a mature way to say, yes, there are some things that we share in our scopes of practice, but there are some key differences. This is what our training demonstrates. This is what our standards demonstrate. Go and have a look at the set of physiotherapy standards in your local jurisdiction. Sit them alongside the international standards that I just showed you. And there will be some similarities, but there will be some key differences, and that's what we really want to celebrate. But again, that's a really difficult question to answer. But be respectful, take the high road, and there are, if you look up the media and some recent media releases in Australia, there are, in the not too distant past, some really less than desirable interactions between the APA, which is the Australian Physiotherapy Association, and Exercise and Sports Science Australia.
Okay. Excellent. That's terrific, Nathan. We've reached our time limit, unfortunately, because I know that we could talk at length on this topic, but certainly really appreciate you getting up very early in Australia to talk to us and delivering a very informative presentation, which I know we really appreciate and will be valued by our members. So thank you very much for that. Just for those who are still on the call or those who join us on our YouTube channel, just a reminder, our next webinar is the 28th of November with Joe Warren talking about scientific cultures benefiting scientific progress. And also to check out our website, www.isesa.ie, for further information in relation to blogs, podcasts, and other events that are happening in Ireland in the space of sport and exercise science. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good night, everyone from Ireland. Have a good morning from everyone in Australia.